before it starts going.
Hello. Today we're going to be arguing whether or not torture is morally justifiable. I'm Arjun.
I'm Kathleen.
I'm Paul. And so we'll just go ahead and begin. So before we begin to make judgments concerning torture, I'd like to fully define what torture is. According to Sue Miller, a professor of philosophy at Charles Sturt University, quote, torture is the intentional infliction of extreme physical suffering on some non-consenting, defenseless other person for the purpose of breaking their will, end quote. Many people run to a theoretical perspective and claim that torture is morally wrong. However, I do stress that we should be looking at torture in a more realistic and situational-based sense in the grander scheme of things. So my first point is, when taking the morality of torture into consideration, we need to differentiate the different types of torture. So one example would be the reported torture at Guantanamo Bay of criminals. And so in this case, there isn't really a clear goal behind the torture. And personally, I would argue that in cases like these, the torture is morally wrong. And then you can take another example, which would be the information extracted from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was a high-value target in the search for Osama bin Laden. So Forbes magazine's sources claim that this information may have gotten the ball rolling on gathering the intelligence required to identify the bin Laden couriers, who ultimately led us to Osama. And although this was a small piece in the puzzle, but when you look at the bigger process, it contributed to the elimination of a global public enemy. My second point is, under extreme circumstances, it calls for extreme measures. Interestingly enough, according to an ABC News poll, about 59% of the Americans supported the CIA's harsh interrogation techniques used on terrorism suspects after the 9/11 attacks. In extreme cases like these, most people would support torture when you consider other people's lives. Regular nonviolent interrogation techniques, well, they may not also work. So, like I said, in extreme situations, they call for extreme measures. So, at some point we may need to go, resort to torture. Thirdly, it is possible that the criminal in question may say anything to avoid being tortured and save themselves. So, like I said, in a more extreme case, torture might be a valid option. Since ethics and morality are subjective, and different people have different opinions on the morality of torture, we should focus on the more objective benefits gained from torture. For example, like the previous example of the information extracted from the terrorists and information received from interrogation, rather than the justifiability based on our emotions. And for my third point, in specific situations, the lives of many is of greater importance than the criminal in question. So if you consider a ticking bomb situation where a terrorist group has planted a bomb in the middle of the city, if the bomb were to go off, it would kill thousands of people. And the police have captured one of the terrorists. And if the terrorists were to disclose the location of the device, then the police could possibly disarm it and save those thousands of lives. In this case, time is slipping away and there's no time to evacuate the city. The terrorist is refusing to comply in response to regular questioning and interrogation. So in this dire situation, if it were up to you, would you resort to torture to get valuable information about the device to possibly save lives? And again, in this situation, who is more important, the criminal or the innocent people? I'm in no way taking torture lightly. Torture is a cruel evil and should be taken very seriously. However, sometimes regular interrogation techniques may not work, and in dire situations such as acts of terrorism, extreme circumstances call for extreme measures. And the information acquired from these methods contributed to a larger part in the process and may have been the difference between life and death. Ultimately, if you were in a critical position and your loved ones were on the line, what lengths would you go through to save them? Thank you. So we'll go ahead and do the cross-examination.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Okay, so my first question would be, what do you think about, obviously using torture to get information and stuff, how can you be sure that that intel is correct and isn't false or coerced or they just said it because they wanted it to stop?
Well, like I said, in extreme situations, even if it's for the possibility of it, if there are multiple lives on the line, I think that it would be justified. Because I don't think someone, especially if there's torture involved, I don't think someone would just say false information and then because that would just lead to more torture when we find out that it's false information. So I think that would be.
And then I have just a second question would be, um, what how well, how do you feel about defining if the person really is innocent or not innocent?
Okay, I think that would need to require, I think, solid evidence so that we could, it would give us a valid reason to go to those extreme measures. So I think that if we can prove that the suspect in question is part of a terrorist organization or has a history of terrorism or anything extreme like that, then I think again it would be valid.
Okay, so my question is, oh, well, okay, so in situations that you're talking about, those are very certain circumstances. Like they know that person is a terrorist, or they know that person has valuable information. But in circumstances where there are people that may or may not have that information, like let's say a person who is seen with terrorists or seen like affiliated with terrorists, and they may or may not have the information. Let's say they're a wife of a terrorist or like
Okay.
children of terrorists. Um, would you say that that type of terror is justified?
Well, like I said, I think my entire argument is based around, that torture shouldn't be used like out of nowhere. It should be used with specific and extreme circumstances, which is why I gave a specific situation like that. Because in a situations like that, it would make a lot more sense to use torture. But like I said, my whole argument is revolved around in a specific situation and under extreme circumstances, torture would be used. But other than that, I don't think it would be moral.
And my other question is, no, actually, I forgot it. Okay, never mind.
Okay.
Okay, so I am obviously the opposing side on whether or not it is morally acceptable to use torture. I'm going to be arguing that the use of torture is not a moral means of getting information. To start with, the definition of what torture is, according to our Constitution, the CIA, and our dictionary, torture is defined by our government as an act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession. As of now, the U.S. government does have laws against using torture. That it's not supposed to be used. It's against the law. There's numerous articles noted and laws noted into our Constitution and everything like that from previous, because of previously using it late in earlier years, they determined that it is not legal. There is the big controversial. Is that the word? Controversy that the government still do use it, or if they don't use it. Torture is morally wrong because it strips the individual of their rights, their dignity, and often it also ends with their lives. To get burned, cut, drowned, or any of the countless forms of torture is not the way to get an answer from an individual, and it is not acceptable for any other potential reasons. Statistics-wise, 50% of people in any country, including America itself, fear being tortured if they are ever taken into custody. This was discussed by Amnesty International. They are part of the CIA. Also, 82% of public opinion globally is in favor of international and home rules against torture. There's also reported of 141 countries over the past 5 years that have encountered torture or ill treatments to get information that not all had. Torture was once used as a means by military and government to receive intel, information, and confessions. Yes, sometimes torture can be used for reasons that are appropriate, such as my opponent had mentioned, life-threatening or country-threatening situations like bombings and such like that. However, there are numerous other ways and techniques available in order to get different results. This type of procedure to get information is simply just monstrous. There are also very real risks of committing murder, mental and emotional disabilities from having been tortured. And there's also the very, very real possibility that that person being tortured is actually innocent. There's no way to 100% prove innocence or not. Countless families over the years have lost loved ones, young and old, due to the immoral and illegal use of torture, some who were innocent and some who were not. Torture is not effective. Types of torture include drowning, where they will take the suspect and put a towel over their face and pour water over it so they pretty much can't breathe and they're drowning without actually drowning, which can also lead to dry drowning, which is very hard to prevent and come back from. There's also physical penetration, such as using weapons like knives, needles, scalpels, saws, causing physical damage to someone or lacerations, physical beating using fists, any type of blunt object, starvation of water and food. An infantry lieutenant said for himself that he was embarrassed and shameful of his own government, the CIA and Army, because he witnessed during his time they used torture to get information, and the person was actually innocent, and the life was lost. He decided that it was, He admitted that he felt severe shame and anger that our country, the one that is supposed to be peaceful and mightiest of all, decided that it was morally okay to become barbarous like those that we see as our enemies. How can our country's people sit there and shiver in fear and disgust when one of our own is tortured, but then when it's someone else, it is suddenly acceptable? The use of it is, as I previously stated, is to get information of any sort, and the lack of effect that it does have by David Sussman can cause, you can get false information. Someone may stop and say whatever they need to make the pain stop, and it can take a long time or maybe never for them to even realize if the information is false or not. There's false accusations of the individual. The individual is accused but may not be the right person. Person may not respond to torture. There are those who can handle physical pain and mental pain and just shut down and give up, and they don't fight anymore. There's the potential of death. There's the coercion and manipulation, which is what I think torture does, is coerce and manipulate people into doing things that they don't want to do. Like I said, it causes mental, physical, and emotional damage. It's unethical and inhumane because it does not meet the ethical requirements of the U.S. ethic laws. It's immoral. And as for it being immoral, it is the act of someone trying to play God, pick and choosing who and what kind of torture to use. It's as if the individual's well-being in life is worth less than others. That is simply immoral. The Vice President, an example of torture not being used appropriately, Vice President Dick Cheney did use torture and authorize it with the CIA, although he does deny it. He chained a Japanese individual, drowned him in water, and let him freeze to death in the custody of the CIA because they felt that he had information that they needed or wanted. The individual was actually innocent of all charges, and it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. This didn't help or solve anything. All it did was take the life of an innocent individual and leave a family to mourn. Possible solutions for this, besides torture, would be to enforce laws against torture, prevent abuse and strengthen intelligence gathering, close secret prisons and ghost prisoners, suspend extrajudicial transfers of individuals, direct the Authority General to investigate potential criminal conduct related to detainee abuse, enhancement of cooperation between human intelligence collectors in the intelligence community, and revoking and redating all orders and memoranda, I don't know how to pronounce that word, authorizing cruel treatment and secret detention. In conclusion, this argument is not so simple. I personally, and I know others, have at some point and would, if in a specific situation, would for an instance forget their stance against torture and replace with support of torturous acts. Although this may be true, it still does not mean that it is morally acceptable to use torture for any reason. It is not up to any one person to determine whose life is and is not worth anything or worth more than another's. There are countless ways to get information, ways like speaking to them, which can be done in various ways also, or you can offer safety, security, or different circumstances. Torturing a human being is not the only thing to be feared. We should fear those who are okay with committing such acts, those who can sit there as they destroy another father, mother, brother, sister, family, or friend, and not even blink. What kind of person can do such a thing? How is torturing another for information or whatever have you different from those who commit murder and assault on our streets, the ones that we fight to put away, the faces that we see and look at shamefully and fight to have imprisoned? This is 2015, and as America, we have more than enough means and resources to get the job done without damaging another person, whether it is physically, mentally, or emotionally. It's that simple. Where are the morals in torture?
So we'll go ahead with the glasses on.
Which is just you, right?
Yeah, okay. So you stated that torture strips the rights of criminals, but would you still say that they deserve to keep their rights even after putting other lives in danger? Would you still put the criminal's life over the possibility of thousands or maybe numerous innocent lives?
So, personally, I mean, it's difficult to say because, like we've talked about already, it really depends on the situation. I think that torture should be the very, very last resort if it is to be used. I think there are certain situations where it may be necessary, but I don't think it should be the automatic go-to of any situation. And as for criminals, yes, people are criminals, but I think it depends on what they're being convicted of, and not just any criminal should be tortured.
So what about a criminal with who we can prove is part of a terrorist organization that has a history of harming people through acts of terrorism? So what if we can justify that? What would you say?
If it is proven and it's justified, I still believe that there are many different ways. You would be like, your mind would just be blown if you took the time to talk to someone and you learn who they are and you learn about them and you pick their brain. And that's why we have specialists like psychologists and behavioralists and people like that who can read people and get to know people even without them admitting something, find the truth without having to cause them physical pain.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and follow that.
So you.
Yeah, all right. When we think of something being ethical, we think of whether it is right or wrong or whether it is good or evil. However, when we think of like a tool, it is slightly more complicated because you have to think about the user's intention. You have to think about the actual act itself. And no one would ever call a hacksaw altruistic or a pencil evil. When talking about ethics in terms of tools, we talk about things about like efficiency or potential for malicious use. Torture itself is an action, but is also a tool. A tool that many believe is effective, an effective means to a necessary end. However, when looking at these ethical standards for tools, it is clear that torture does not fit into these standards. For a solve of this, we can well imagine that in a specific situation, confronted with a prisoner who knows and whose words can save thousands, we would resort to torture. But that it is absolutely crucial that we do not elevate this desperate choice into a universal principle. like we've stated before throughout this debate, torture is like the use of torture is not a universal like thing that you can say no or yes to. It's a thing that we have to be very careful with, and it's a very situational thing. Um, we've given examples about how it's worked, and but I want to give an example of a time where it actually uh, was not effective. One example is of Nair Arar. He's a Syrian Canadian engineer who one day had unsuspectedly had coffee with a terrorist, and he was then held by the U.S. for a whole year, where he was subjected to torture, sexual abuse. He was locked into a dark room for many months without any human contact. And eventually, a year later, after he was released, the Syrian ambassador in Washington um, made a statement saying that they found that he was not linked to terrorism in any way. It is a widely known idea in psychology and in behavioral studies that extreme coercion is likely to produce its desired behavioral effects. So, like a person gets tortured, and in that moment, their adrenaline shoots up. They get very scared. There's the fight or flight, so they just say whatever it takes for them to not feel the pain anymore. And once the pain stops and they realize what they've done, um, by then it's already too late because they've already said what they said, and the people have that against them. Um, my next point is that torture itself is a malicious act and it's an evil act. Um, Many numerous countries, including the U.S., um, the European Union, the Arab Union, and even the Geneva Convention, consider torture evil, and they declare it to be illegal. And torture, by its almost definition, is malicious because the definition of malicious by the California Penal Code 188 defines um, malice as a party's intention to do harm or injury to another party. So, by its definition, torture is trying to use pain and suffering on a certain individual in order to break their will. So, in a sense, that is malicious and it's evil. Um, Kantian ethics say that people must not be used as a means to end, but rather the end in themselves. So, in this sense, you know, we're putting people's lives at stake when we use torture. We're putting their humanity at stake, and it's not a worthwhile endeavor to use those. If you take the humanity of one person and tear it down, it doesn't help it doesn't help you morally, and it's not justifiable, even if you are trying to save the humanity of others, because it's not a certain thing, as the philosopher um, Salvage has said. To conclude, torture fails ethically in any realm of usage, but for interrogation, it does not even always achieve the results that it seeks. It is widely accepted nowadays that it should not be used, yet the only thing that keeping it is our general belief that it does work, despite the facts that it doesn't. The use of torture needs to end, and we can finally regain our humanity as a society.
Okay. So for our cross exam, so put yourself in the perspective of the ticking bomb situation that I described earlier, where there are thousands of people's lives at stake, and it's too late to evacuate the city, and we have terrorists in question. So if the lives of your loved ones were on the line, what would you do in this case? If you had the power to and you had the power and the resources to possibly gain the information through maybe extreme means such as torture. So in this case, if your loved ones were on the line, what would you say?
For me, myself, I think in situations like that, it's a very sensitive thing, even for yourself, and it's a very personal thing for yourself. So I think it's a very hard thing to do, but I think you have to, in those situations, we have to like try to remove ourselves and remove our potential biases from the situation, and we have to really understand like what we're doing when we're torturing a person, or what it really means to take someone's rights away, like in that manner. And in those specific situations you're talking about the bombing, um, it's a very dire, it's a very immediate situation. If it was a certain thing, that person had a certain intel, I could see why it would be justifiable.
Right.
But those type of situations are far in between.
Right.
Like most of the torture that goes on in most like governments or like in terrorist organizations or whatever, it's usually like that person is just like very like related to the certain thing in very like weird ways. Like not
Right.
very clear ways.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the whole point of my argument. That in extreme situations, if we can prove certain things that would in a sense justify torture, then I would say that torture would be justifiable in this case. And so both you and Katie mentioned alternative solutions to torture. That what would you say are some alternative solutions that would be useful besides regular interrogations?
Well, okay. I think talking about solutions. I think for for torture, like I said, it's a very sensitive thing. So I think you have to approach it with a lot of skepticism, a lot of thought and stuff, especially when people's lives are at stake, especially like what you're saying, like in bomb situations and stuff. Solutions wise, I think people like Katie said, there's specialists, there's behavioral therapists, there's psychologists, and I understand like torture is like not the same thing as intimidation, but I think intimidation is definitely like a very valuable thing that is useful. You don't always have to resort to physically harming the person. There's always like mental things, even though mental things are nothing to joke with either. But there's certain ways to do it that I think will like be less scarring for that person.
Okay, that's good. We'll go ahead with our last round of rebuttals, and then we'll finish. Okay. So, like I said, in extreme circumstances and extreme situations where we can prove something about that the terrorist has had a history of putting other people's lives in danger or is part of a specific organization that does those kinds of harmful things, I would say that, I think torture would be justifiable in these situations, especially if we're considering the lives of others. And so I'd say that, both of my opposition, on the opposition team, they said that that torture is morally wrong, and then they've given different examples of whether or not it is wrong. And but I would like to say that people have different opinions on morality. People, there's a lot of people that believe that torture would be justifiable, and then there's also people that would say that in specific situations it wouldn't be moral. But like I said, I'd like to conclude that in extreme circumstances, I think that would be justifiable, and that's really that's really what my whole argument revolves around. And that's how it
So, my final rebuttal. I know something that neither, like my partner didn't really touch up on as much, and my opponent had a lot of questions of, was being in a high stress situation on the go now. I think that is why we have people who are specially trained, because they need to remove emotion. Asking an individual like one of us, college students sitting here, what would we do or what would we want or approve, I think is not only inappropriate but defeats the purpose. We aren't specialized to handle those situations because we aren't trained to control our emotions. Our instincts and our emotions are what we have specialists, Army, Navy, military, CIA, our government in general, who are supposed to have all of these high-class specialists who are highly trained in situations like that in order to prevent having to use torture. The main focus of all of those arguments are supposed to be about it being moral or immoral, not justifiable or not being justifiable or unjustifiable. It's whether or not you think it's okay to demoralize and cause and inflict pain on someone for information or for confessions even. Police have also been known to use torture in order to get a confession out of someone, which is coercion, which is also illegal. And plain and simple, it's morally not okay.
For my final rebuttal, I like to state that us as a society and us as like, even a world, like in many governments and just in general, like it's known like torture is this like very serious, very almost not taboo, but very very not thing that anyone really takes lightly, and it's a thing that we universally as a society has to like said it's illegal and it's something that we don't touch lightly and we don't ever touch at all if anything. Um, and I think that in itself, as a society, we've all universally agreed upon another that something like this is not within our ethics and our morality as a society. So in conclusion, I would just say that as far as our human conscience goes, torture is something that is very very damning to our consciences and our psychological yeah well-beings, yeah, psychological well-beings.
Okay. So that concludes our debate. Thank you for listening.